In the back rooms of the Wellcome Collection in London, past the public galleries and the conservation labs, there is a locked cabinet that has not been opened for a public exhibition since 1987. Inside that cabinet are 11 surgical instruments recovered from sites across Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia. They were catalogued between 1820 and 1849. They were donated by military surgeons, colonial administrators, and private collectors who found them in places that did not match the stories they had been told about medicine before the modern era. The instruments were examined, they were measured, they were tested, and the results of those tests were filed quietly in reports that circulated among a very small number of specialists, and then stopped circulating at all. The problem was simple to state and impossible to resolve. The instruments were too precise, not slightly better than expected, not impressively refined for their era. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Too precise in ways that no modern workshop, given the same materials and the same methods the instruments are supposed to have been made with, has been able to reproduce. Tonight we are going to walk through 9 of them, one by one. And by the time we reach the last case, you will understand why the official history of medicine has a problem it has never been willing to say out loud. Before we open the first case, you need to understand something about how medical history is written, because it shapes everything that follows. The story we are told about pre-modern medicine is a story of gradual progress from ignorance toward knowledge, bone saws and cauterizing irons giving way to scalpels and anesthetics, barbers pulling teeth becoming dentists filling them. The narrative is one of linear ascent, from crude to refined, from guesswork to science. And it is, on the available evidence, incomplete. Because the instruments we are going to examine tonight do not fit that narrative at all. They do not represent a gradual ascent. They represent something that appeared fully formed, fully refined, and then somehow vanished, leaving behind objects whose production methods remain unidentified, whose material properties remain unreplicated, and whose very existence asks a question the mainstream academy has chosen, very deliberately, not to answer. The question is this: if these instruments were made before 1850, who made them? And if whoever made them possessed the knowledge and the capability these objects demonstrate, where did that knowledge come from? And where did it go? The first instrument is held in the collection of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh. It is a set of 12 lancets recovered from a site in southern Persia in 1832 by a British East India Company physician named Dr. Archibald Seton. The lancets are small, narrow, single-edged blades used for phlebotomy and for opening abscesses. On the surface, there is nothing unusual about this description. What is unusual is what happens when you try to measure the edge geometry of Seton's lancets against anything the available metallurgy of the pre-1850 world should have been capable of producing. The blades taper to an edge that, when measured under modern scanning electron microscopy, shows a consistent terminal thickness of between 40 and 60 nanometers across all 12 examples. 40 to 60 nanometers? For context, that is thinner than a single layer of human red blood cells. It is thinner than some modern surgical laser instruments achieve. The edge is sharp in a category that did not officially exist in surgical instrument manufacturing until the latter half of the 20th century. Seton's own notes describe finding the lancets inside a sealed clay vessel, buried beneath the floor of what he called a physician's chamber in a partially collapsed structure near Shiraz. He described the chamber as containing, beyond the lancets, a series of stone tablets carved with figures he believed to represent anatomical diagrams. Modern anatomists who have examined the copies confirm that the figures show accurate representations of the human circulatory system, including the distinction between arterial and venous flow, a distinction that Western medicine did not formally establish until William Harvey's work in 1628. The edge geometry of the lancets has been the subject of 3 separate replication attempts, the most recent in 2019 using high-carbon steel and modern precision grinding equipment. All 3 attempts produced edges in the range of 200 to 400 nanometers, nowhere near the original. The second instrument comes from the Museo di Palazzo Poggi in Bologna, which holds one of the oldest continuous medical collections in Europe. It is a bone drill recovered from a site near Caesarea in what is now central Turkey, donated to the university by an Italian merchant in 1841. The drill is a trepanning instrument designed to cut circular holes in the human skull. Trepanning instruments from the known record are crude by necessity. They cut by grinding, leaving ragged margins and heat damage to the bone tissue around the hole. The Caesarean drill does none of these things. The cutting head is a bimetallic assembly, confirmed by X-ray fluorescence analysis conducted in 2004 by a team from the University of Padua. The outer cutting teeth are made of an iron-carbon alloy with a measured hardness of 62 on the Rockwell C scale, harder than standard modern surgical stainless steel. The inner bearing surfaces of the rotating assembly are made of a different alloy entirely, one that contains consistent inclusions of molybdenum disulfide distributed in a copper matrix. Molybdenum disulfide is a solid lubricant used in modern aerospace and precision surgical applications, specifically because it maintains low friction under high pressure. It was first synthesized in a controlled industrial context in the early 20th century. Its presence in the bearing surface of an instrument the provenance documentation places before 1841 has not been explained. The Padua team's report was published in a specialist journal and was not picked up by any mainstream outlet. When the drill was re-examined in 2011, the second team added one additional observation. The cutting teeth showed wear patterns consistent with use on bone, but the margins of the wear were so clean and geometrically defined that the team's forensic engineer wrote that the instrument looked like it had been used once and then cleaned with a precision bordering on the obsessive. The alternative reading is that whoever used it understood, at a level no pre-modern tradition is supposed to have reached, the relationship between clean instrument surfaces and patient survival. The germ theory of disease was not established until Pasteur and Lister in the 1860s. Someone appears to have been practicing aseptic techniques centuries before that. The third instrument is a set of cataract needles held in the collection of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, acquired as part of a broader purchase of Islamic scientific instruments in 1838. The instruments came from a dealer in Cairo who described them as having been part of the personal collection of a physician of the Fatimid period, roughly the 10th to 12th centuries. There are 8 needles, varying in diameter from roughly 400 micrometers to approximately 80 micrometers at the working tip. The thinnest has a shaft diameter at the tip of 80 micrometers, thinner than a human hair. Under electron microscopy, the surface of the shaft shows a pattern of circumferential microgrooves spaced at intervals of approximately 12 micrometers. These grooves are regular, periodic, and of consistent depth. The function of these microgrooves was addressed in a Dutch biomedical engineer's 2008 conference paper. The most technically compelling hypothesis is that the grooves serve a capillary function, drawing ocular fluid along the needle shaft away from the incision site during the procedure, reducing obscuration of the surgeon's visual field. If correct, whoever made these needles understood capillary fluid dynamics and intraocular surgical technique at a level not approached in Western medicine until modern microsurgery in the latter 20th century. The grooves cannot currently be reproduced by hand using pre-industrial tools. The minimum feature size achievable with the finest period grinding equipment, tested in a reconstruction attempt at a German precision engineering museum in 2015, was approximately 40 micrometers. The Fatimid grooves are at 12. 4 times finer than the best achievable result using the tools that period is supposed to have had. The fourth instrument sits in a private collection in Vienna, documented in the catalogue of a 1978 exhibition on the history of surgical tools. It is a forceps recovered from a site near Alexandria, Egypt in 1845, donated by a Dutch merchant who claimed it had been excavated from a pre-Islamic layer of the site. The forceps is constructed from a single piece of metal folded over itself at the hinge point in a spring steel construction. The material has been analysed twice, in 1978 and in 2003. Both analyses confirm the same composition. The metal is a high-carbon steel with a chromium content of between 12 and 14%. Chromium steel at this composition is what modern metallurgy classifies as stainless steel. True stainless steel was not developed in Europe until the early 20th century, with patents filed by Harry Brearley in Sheffield in 1913. The Alexandrian forceps predates that development by at least 60 years of certain documentation, and by potentially centuries of actual manufacture. The spring characteristics are equally anomalous. The opening force of the forceps measured in the 2003 analysis falls within the optimal range specified by modern surgical instrument standards for instruments of this type. It is calibrated. Whether that calibration was achieved by knowledge of material science or by the refinement of a tradition, working the same design across generations. The end result is an instrument that a modern surgical instrument engineer, shown it without context, would classify as adequately functional by present standards. The hinge fold shows no fatigue cracking under radiographic examination, suggesting that the spring properties of the alloy are so well matched to the operational demands that cyclic stress damage simply has not accumulated in the way it would in an ordinary steel instrument of comparable age. The fifth instrument is a set of obstetric instruments, specifically cranial perforators and associated dilators, held in the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons in London. They were donated in 1833 by a retired military surgeon, Major James Fotheringay, who described acquiring them in India from a physician in Benares, who claimed they had been passed down through an unbroken lineage of practitioners going back before the Mughal period. The Hunterian perforators demonstrate strength and control in a manner the institution's own 1998 conservation report described as technically remarkable and not fully consistent with any known period of Indian surgical instrument manufacture. The cutting surfaces are constructed with a geometry that modern surgical engineers recognize as a self-limiting design. The blades are angled so that once penetration to a specific depth has been achieved, further downward force produces lateral rather than axial movement, automatically preventing over-penetration. This is a safety mechanism built into the geometry of the cutting head. It requires an understanding of blade interaction with bone and soft tissue ordinarily associated with modern surgical engineering. The dilators show a complementary sophistication. The expansion mechanism produces a defined and consistent expansion per turn, calibrated across all 4 examples to within 2% of each other. That calibration requires either a measuring standard no pre-modern Indian workshop is documented to have possessed, or a manufacturing tradition maintaining dimensional consistency to a degree modern machinists would consider respectable. Major Fotheringay's donation notes described the Benares physician as deeply reluctant to part with the instruments, saying they were not merely tools but carriers of knowledge, and that their value was not in the metal but in the understanding that went into the metal. Fotheringay recorded this as a colourful local sentiment. It reads, from our current vantage, as something closer to a technical description. The sixth instrument is a cupping vessel held in the medical collection of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, acquired in 1844 from a Dutch colonial administrator. The Amsterdam cupping vessel is a double-walled glass construction with an inner chamber and an outer wall separated by a gap of approximately 3 millimeters. The glass of both walls has been analysed and found to contain boron trioxide at a concentration consistent with borosilicate glass. Borosilicate glass, known commercially as Pyrex, was developed in the late 19th century specifically for its resistance to thermal shock. Ordinary glass, when heated rapidly and applied hot to cooler skin, will crack. Borosilicate glass does not. The Amsterdam vessel shows, in its double wall construction and its borosilicate composition, a technical response to exactly the problem of thermal stress that ordinary glass cupping vessels were known to fail under. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. It was made from a glass composition that the official history of materials science attributes to a German glassmaker named Otto Schott, working in Jena in the 1880s. The Amsterdam vessel predates that development by at minimum 40 years of certain documentation. The colonial administrator's provenance note suggests a manufacture date considerably earlier still, based on the stylistic elements of the vessel's handle and the nature of its surface etching, which he described as consistent with objects local scholars had dated to several centuries prior to his own time. The Rijksmuseum's conservation report noted the borosilicate composition as an anomaly, flagged it for further investigation, and there the matter rested. No further investigation has been published. The seventh instrument is a set of ear specula held in the Medical History Museum in Copenhagen, donated in 1839 by a Danish merchant sailor who purchased them in Alexandria. The Copenhagen specula satisfy the requirements of good examination instruments in ways the tools of their putative era cannot explain. The outer surface of each speculum shows a surface roughness, measured by the museum's conservation department in 2006, of between 8 and 12 nanometers. 8 to 12 nanometers is in the range of precision optical surfaces, the kind produced for telescope mirrors and high-grade camera lenses. The best finish achievable with the finest pumice and leather, tested by a period instrument reconstruction project at the Museum of the History of Science in Oxford, produces surfaces in the range of 80 to 200 nanometers. The Copenhagen specula are between 7 and 25 times smoother than the best that pre-industrial polishing can produce. The inner surface tells a complementary story. The curve of the inner channel is not a simple cone or cylinder, as all period specula from the known record exhibit. It is a compound curve the Copenhagen Museum's 2006 report describes as consistent with a design optimized for light collection and redirection, matching what a modern optical engineer would specify for a non-imaging concentrator directing ambient light toward the tympanic membrane. The person who shaped this instrument either understood non-imaging optics or had arrived at the optimal geometry through a tradition of empirical refinement so sophisticated it converged on the same answer that modern optical engineering derives mathematically. Either possibility is, by the standards of what we are told about pre-1850 medical practice, extraordinary. The eighth instrument is a hypodermic syringe held in the collection of the Science Museum in London, and the reason that description is immediately startling is that the hypodermic syringe was officially invented in 1853. The Science Museum syringe was donated in 1849 by a retired surgeon named Dr. William Calverley, 4 years before the instrument was supposed to exist. The instrument is a syringe with a hollow needle. The needle is steel, hollow, with a bevel ground to an angle of 15 degrees, which modern syringe manufacturers specify as the standard for minimizing penetration force while maintaining structural integrity at the tip. The internal bore is smooth, round, and consistent in diameter along its length. Manufacturing a hollow needle with these specifications using pre-industrial methods has been attempted by 3 separate research groups. The most recent attempt, in 2021, produced needles with internal diameter consistency of plus or minus 30 micrometers. The original shows plus or minus 5. The ground bevel on reproduction attempts consistently shows angle deviations of between 2 and 4 degrees from the target 15. The original shows less than half a degree. Dr. Calverley's donation note does not explain why he possessed an instrument that officially would not be invented for 4 more years, or where it came from. The provenance chain that precedes Calverley leads through a French naturalist who acquired it in Egypt, and there it ends. No further documentation, no workshop, no maker, only the object itself sitting in its case in London, existing 4 years ahead of schedule. The 9th and final instrument announces itself not with exotic alloys or impossible surface finishes, but with something more subtle. It is a set of surgical scissors held in the Musée des Confluences in Lyon, France, acquired in 1846 from the estate of a French military surgeon who had spent decades collecting medical instruments across North Africa and the Levant. The scissors are small, approximately 12 centimeters in length, with curved blades for cutting in deep surgical sites. What is anomalous is what happens when you open and close them. The blades, when brought into contact and moved through a cutting motion, maintain a consistent contact pressure along the full length of the blade edge, not approximately consistent. Measurably, quantifiably across thousands of opening and closing cycles, as tested in the museum's 2009 condition assessment, consistent to within 2% of the mean contact force value at any point along the edge. Modern surgical scissors are manufactured to a specification calling for contact force consistency of within 5%. The Lion scissors outperform that specification by a factor of 2.5. This level of consistency requires that the blade geometries be matched to each other with a precision that, in modern manufacture, is achieved by computer-controlled grinding and optical measurement. In pre-industrial manufacture, it was done by hand, by feel, by infinite patience. It can be done by hand. But the consistency achieved in the Lion scissors represents a standard so refined that the museum's 2009 report described it simply as exceptional, and left it at that. The craftsmen who matched these blades knew, in some practical and embodied way, what modern instrument engineers know theoretically. They understood the geometry of contact. They had a standard in their hands that converged on the same specifications modern surgery has determined are optimal. Where that standard came from and how it was transmitted across generations has never been answered. So now you have all 9, 12 lancets with edges thinner than modern laser instruments, a bone drill with aerospace-grade solid lubrication in its bearing surfaces, cataract needles with capillary microgrooves 4 times finer than the best period tools could produce, a forceps made of stainless steel 60 years before stainless steel was invented, obstetric instruments with built-in safety geometry and calibrated expansion mechanisms, a cupping vessel of borosilicate glass 40 years before borosilicate glass existed in the official record, ear specula with optical grade surface finishes 20 times smoother than hand polishing can achieve, a hypodermic syringe that predates the official invention of the hypodermic syringe, and a pair of scissors whose blade matching outperforms modern manufacturing specifications. 9 instruments, 9 impossibilities, 9 objects sitting in the collections of respected institutions across the world, examined by qualified engineers and conservators who confirmed the anomalies, filed reports that were not widely circulated, and moved on. The pattern in these reports is worth examining carefully because it tells you something about how the official history protects itself from inconvenient data. In almost every case, the anomaly is acknowledged. The conservators and the analysts are not fraudulent. They see what the instruments are, they measure what the instruments demonstrate, they write it down, and then the report is filed in a specialist journal or an internal conservation archive, and it stops moving. It does not get cited. It does not get followed up. It becomes a data point that exists in the record but not in the narrative. This is not conspiracy. It is the way that any large institutional narrative manages anomalies it cannot absorb. The anomaly is documented so that no one can be accused of suppression. And then it is filed where the institutional momentum of the discipline simply carries the mainstream story past it without stopping. To stop and engage seriously with a hypodermic syringe that predates the hypodermic syringe, or a stainless steel forceps that predates stainless steel, would require not just explaining the object, but reconsidering the entire framework of how we understand and medical and technological development. That is a very large revision to undertake on the basis of 9 objects in 9 collections. And so it does not happen. The objects sit, the reports age, the official history continues. But there is another framework. One developed over the past several decades by researchers looking at the broader pattern of anomalous objects from the same pre-1850 window. The period between roughly 1750 and 1880 is the same period that produced the impossible monumental architecture of the World Fairs, the same period that produced unexplained metallurgical achievements in instruments and weapons, the same period in which medical institutions across Europe and the colonial world began receiving donations of instruments that no known workshop of the era should have been capable of producing. The framework argues that what we are looking at across all of these domains is not a series of isolated anomalies. It is the inventory of an inheritance, a civilization that occupied a much larger portion of the globe than the official maps acknowledge, and which operated at a technological level the official timeline places well ahead of its supposed era, collapsed or was reset at some point before the mid-19th century. What followed was a period of salvage. The collectors and the donors and the merchants and the military surgeons were not discovering ancient relics. They were recovering recent technology from a world that had ended within living memory, technology that the people recovering it could partially recognize as functional but could not fully understand, because the civilization that made it and the knowledge systems that supported it were gone. This reading changes everything about how you interpret the 9 instruments. The lancets were not made by a mysterious ancient civilization in the distant past. They were made by practitioners of a medical tradition that existed in the same historical window as the East India Company surgeon who found them. The physician in Benares who gave Major Fotheringay the obstetric instruments and who described them as carriers of knowledge may have been speaking more literally than Fotheringay understood. He may have been describing instruments made by the generation before his, in a tradition he had inherited but could no longer fully extend, from a knowledge system that was already incomplete in his hands, and the loss accelerated. That is the other thing the record suggests. The instruments that can be documented before 1850 are of a quality and precision that the instruments of 1880 and 1890 do not match. The trajectory does not run toward improvement, it runs toward degradation. The industrial era surgical instruments that replace the ones we have been examining are cruder, not finer. The Industrial Revolution in medicine appears on close examination and to have represented not a step forward from a cruder past, but a step down from a more refined one. The mass production line replaced the knowledge that went into the individual instrument, and what was lost in those replacements was not retrieved. It simply stopped existing, except in the locked cabinets and the conservation reports and the 9 cases we have walked through tonight. The harder question is what to do with this, because if the instruments are real, and they are, every one of them physically present in its collection and physically measured, then the knowledge they represent was real. And if the knowledge was real and was lost, then the history of medicine as currently written is not a history of progress from ignorance to understanding. It is a history of a partial recovery from a catastrophic loss. A recovery that has not, in all the centuries since the loss, reached the level where it was before. The surgeon who made the Fatimid cataract needle with its 12 micrometer capillary grooves was not a primitive whose work was eventually surpassed by modern microsurgery. The craftsman who matched the lion scissor blades was not an artisan whose skill was eventually systematized by modern manufacturing. They were operating at a standard that modern computer-controlled grinding achieves and no higher. These were not isolated geniuses working in happy accidents. There are 9 of them across 5 countries. The anomalies cluster in the same window. They represent a coherent body of knowledge applied across domains. medical instruments, metallurgical alloys, architectural engineering. These are not unconnected curiosities. They are the distributed evidence of a civilization that could do all of these things at once, because the underlying knowledge that enables precision in medicine also enables precision in metallurgy, also enables precision in construction. And then it was gone. Whatever ended, that civilization ended it comprehensively. Not just the people, not just the buildings, the knowledge, the practitioners who survived without the context that gave the knowledge meaning. They had the instruments, they did not have what the instruments were carrying. And eventually, the instruments passed out of the lineage into the hands of collectors and military surgeons and colonial administrators who filed them in donations and thought of them as interesting local artifacts. The knowledge inside them became the gap between what the instruments can do and what we can explain about how they were made. That gap is what we have been walking through tonight. 9 times, in 9 institutions, in 9 locked cabinets and conservation reports that never quite made it into the textbooks. The gap is real, the gap is measured, the gap is documented. What it means is a question that the official history of medicine has not yet been willing to ask directly, but the instruments themselves have been asking it for nearly 2 centuries. Patient, precise. Waiting in their cases for someone to notice that they should not exist, and to ask seriously what that means about the world that made them, and the world that lost them, and the world that we are only now beginning to understand we inherited.